Hi, everybody. Wanted to get back and talk a little bit about emotion processing and the brain. We talked about some behavioral stuff last time, but I wanted to highlight the importance of the amygdala in this case, and talk a little bit about the different parts of the amygdala, because this is circuitry that I do want you to be familiar with. And of course, as you will have access to your book on the exam, it's a little less stressful than if you had to memorize the structure. But then I will want you to really know nice details and be able to talk about kind of aspects of the circuitry that are important to our discussion here. So, like you read about, emotions are complex, right? And I think that's intuitive when you think about what it's like to experience different types of emotions and combinations of emotions at the same time. Um, so that makes the relationship with what's going on in the brain also very complex. Any single emotion that we would talk about is going to activate lots of different parts of the brain, and the same area can be activated by lots of different types of emotions. So it's hard to narrow down what one emotion would look like in the brain in terms of separating out what those networks look like. It's a little bit too complex, at least in terms of how we understand that relationship at this point. But we can focus in on the amygdala because this does seem to be the central processing center for the different types of emotions and how input from our environment then gets sent to other parts of the brain that can help us process emotional information. So we've talked about the amygdala before. If you remember, even from intro neuro, right, we're talking about a subcortical structure. It's in the medial temporal lobe, and it sits just anterior to the hippocampus. And so the hippocampus and the amygdala also talk to each other a bit as well. And so, there's some general information to think about here, but let's walk through our little diagram here. If you think about interacting with sensory stimuli in our environment. All of our different senses transmit information that can go through the thalamus, right? So the thalamus is that relay center for sensory information in the brain. And the thalamus, in addition to sending information to cortex, like you might have learned before, or you might remember from intro neuro, right? Visual information goes from the thalamus to visual cortex, auditory information goes to the thalamus and then to auditory cortex. But the thalamus also projects to, in addition to other areas, the amygdala, in particular the lateral nucleus. And cortex also talks to the amygdala. And this two-pronged input is actually really important, right? And so kind of a classic example to think about this is, if you've ever walked into a room and you think you see a spider on the ground and you kind of jump a little bit, but then you realize that it's not a spider, it's a fuzzy or a toy on the ground or something like that, and it's not actually a danger or a threat in any way. And the reason that that happens is because of these two different inputs to the lateral nucleus. So that quick version that goes kind of straight from the thalamus to the amygdala and skips the cortex, which lets us do a little bit more cognitive processing, that initial input, right, is kind of quick and dirty. And so you think you see something dangerous and you have that emotional response to it, but then you calm down once that input also gets to get processed by the cortex, give us a little cognitive um, recognition ability there to recognize, okay, not actually a spider, right? So we can calm down. So that part's important. Right. And the lateral nucleus can then talk to the other main nuclei of the amygdala, the basolateral nucleus and the central nucleus. The central nucleus is responsible for kind of the output of emotion, both in terms of overt behaviors, like we talked about last time, like freezing or startle response or something like that, as well as the physiological responses via the autonomic nervous system, like increased arousal, stress hormone releases, and stuff like that. So the central nucleus directs both those behavioral and physiological responses to emotional information. And the basolateral nucleus is the part of the amygdala that talks back to areas in the brain that store memory, like the cortex, right, for kind of general knowledge, basal ganglia for motor types of learning and skill learning, and the hippocampus itself for consolidation, right, as well as maybe autobiographical memory, depending on which of the two theories of memory storage and consolidation that you believe in based on what we talked about a few chapters ago, right? So we can talk a little bit about the different nuclei in general, a little bit more detail, right? So that central nucleus, right, is that main output center that we talked about in terms of expressing emotions for behavior and for physiological responses, right? So in animal studies, if you stimulate this area, you get kind of what we would call species typical defensive responses. So every animal has kind of unique behavioral and physiological profiles for how it is going to respond in different emotional situations, right? And so stimulating the central nucleus, you get both those motor and physiological responses that differ a little bit depending on the species, right? In humans, it can cause positive or negative emotions. And in some cases also can actually cause people to respond in kind of a rage type response. So there's a lot of different things. It's not necessarily specific, right? If you disrupt this part of the amygdala, it can lead to trouble with emotional learning in humans and animals. So if people have damage to this part of the nucleus of the amygdala, for example, there can be issues in emotional learning in those types of paradigms that we talked about in the last video, right? And here's an example of what a response might look like in a situation where you have a lesion to the amygdala as opposed to lesions in the hippocampus or just kind of a control non-lesion group. And if we look at both humans and rats, right, in this case, the learning of a conditioned stimulus that should evoke an emotional response like the first paradigm we talked about in the last video, right? In humans, we look at kind of the skin conductance response, our skin galvanic response. You might have heard it before. So if you've ever learned anything about lie detectors, right, that's one of the things that's looked at there, but it's also used in kind of psychophysiological studies as well, right? And, you know, control subjects and control animals, right, they don't show much of a response. We're looking at freezing behavior in rats like we talked about last time. And hippocampal lesions don't seem to have much of an issue in terms of learning the emotional response. But in both humans and rats, lesioning the amygdala blocks that type of learning, right? And so it does seem to be involved not just in processing an emotion, but in actually learning emotional responses to stimuli. Right? If we look at the lateral amygdala, right, we think that because of the input nature of this particular nucleus, it may play a particularly important role in emotional learning as well. And so it might seem to encode emotional relevance of different stimuli in your environment. That is, for different things that we experience, it may be responsible for kind of assigning different emotions or different strengths of emotion to those stimuli, right? So I talked about kind of the quick and dirty connection that goes straight from the thalamus to the lateral nucleus of the amygdala, right? And then the slower one that goes through cortex, right, that helps us kind of update what it is that we're looking at, right? And so emotional learning seems to actually change what the neurons are doing in the lateral amygdala in particular. So here's some more data that you saw in the chapter, but to re-emphasize this a little bit, right? Here we're looking at the response rate of amygdala neurons to different odor stimuli, right, at baseline, and then after learning that a particular odor might be connected with a negative stimulus. So animals were pre-tested on 2 neutral odors, so almond and anise smells, odors in that case, right? And the amygdala has, right, a baseline level response to different odors. But after the almond odor is paired with a foot shock, we can see a huge change in the shift of responsive amygdala neurons. For the cases where the almond odor is presented, then we see a huge change from about 1,000, right, if we're talking about millivolts per second, up to almost 4,500, right? And actually, we see the ANIS one go down. So there could be a little bit about learning about the relevance of one and the non-relevance of another in that case, right? So a selective increase in activity only to the trained odor, suggesting that the lateral amygdala is encoding the emotional relevance of this stimulus once it's been paired with the foot shock. Basolateral amygdala, right, is the part that talks to cortex and hippocampus and other types of memory storage areas. And so you may have already been aware, even before reading this chapter, that sometimes emotionally relevant things, maybe we remember those things better than others. And so imaging studies do show that emotional events activate the amygdala, right? So if you put somebody in a scanner and you have them do different emotional types of tasks, we typically see increased activation during those tasks in the amygdala. And the amount of amygdala activation does seem to predict increased memory for emotional material, right? And even stronger feelings like, I think I know this more. The more active your amygdala is, the more you believe that you know that piece of information, both at encoding and when you're trying to remember it. And so this is, again, something that you read about in the book where they compared a neutral story to a more emotional story. They shared the same beginning and end of the story, but the middle differed in terms of how emotionally relevant it is. And in the more emotionally relevant story, memory increased for those particular details of the story compared to the neutral story, right? So we can see an increase in memory thanks to increase in emotional content in this case, right? So how does that happen? This is where we kind of complicate our model of the amygdala a little bit more. We can talk more specifically about those outputs to the hippocampus, but we can also add now inputs from our hormone system via the brainstem. So in this case, right, part of that physiological response that we see to stimuli, right, from the autonomic nervous system, right, hormone release, that means this physiological increase here is stimulating the adrenal gland, which can release epinephrine, which activates different areas of the brainstem. We're not going to worry too much about where in the brainstem, but you can note that it's the brainstem, which stimulates the release of norepinephrine, which is going to influence what's happening at the output from the basolateral nucleus. So it can kind of key in and let the basolateral nucleus know whether we need to increase or decrease the kind of storage and memory for particular pieces of information. So it's influencing what's coming out of the basolateral nucleus of the amygdala, both to, cortex, right, but also to the hippocampus, right? So it can then be influencing what's happening in terms of the output from the basolateral nucleus. So if we want to think about this kind of step by step, emotional stimuli cause the release of stress hormones, right? If the hippocampus, if the thalamus, right, and cortex, that input to the lateral nucleus indicate that there is an item with emotional content that we're experiencing, part of what it's going to do is stimulate that behavioral and physiological response to that stimulus, right? And this is then in a way monitored by the basolateral nucleus. You'll notice that the central nucleus doesn't have projections in that direction directly, but kind of via this offshoot, it is influencing the basolateral nucleus, right? Kind of through this relay in the brainstem, where that increase in hormone release stimulates the adrenal gland, which stimulates the brainstem nuclei, which can then influence the basolateral nucleus, right? So altering epinephrine, which is a key part of this pathway, does seem to have an effect on emotion, on memory. It seems to be involved in that feedback. And we can see that in this data here, in this case, that enhancing epinephrine, right? If we boost that release of epinephrine from the adrenal gland to the brainstem, we also see increased memory. So in this case, another study where we're giving rats a foot shock. I know that's getting repetitive. That's a very common mechanism in this literature, right? But when we give a rat a foot shock, right, in a certain chamber, the next time they head to that chamber, they're going to hesitate before going in, right? They think that there may be a negative thing that's going to happen to them. So in our control subjects here, right, after they're given a foot shock, when they entered a certain chamber, right, if we put them back at the doorway, they hesitated for about 50 seconds before re-entering that chamber, right? On the right, we're looking at boosting epinephrine in different animals at different delays, right? So in this case, we're talking about whether we inject them with epinephrine right after that training, right? Or whether we delayed 10, 30, or 120 minutes. The idea is if you pair that boost of epinephrine right after the initial experience, right, you increase kind of the physiological response in that case to the foot shock, then they're going to remember and hesitate much longer. The further away that you inject the epinephrine from when the initial foot shock happened, the less of that effect is there, right? And again, this is all about the pairing of information. So if you pair that increased physiological response to the foot shock, that emotional memory is going to be much stronger. The farther in time out you go before you inject that epinephrine, the less of a memory is going to be there in that case. So keep that in mind. And if you block epinephrine, then in the opposite way, it decreases the boost and recall for emotional stories, right? So there's a nice kind of key aspect that we can see here to the hormone influence on storage of information. All right, so a lot of detail there, right? In the context we're in right now, you're not really memorizing the pathway of the amygdala, right? You should know it because you're going to have to use it to answer questions on the exam. But I would ask that you maybe then spend a little bit of time thinking about that evidence and how it does explain how each part of the amygdala is involved in those specific aspects that we believe it does, because this is well replicated ideas about different parts of the amygdala and their involvement in memory. Right? So that's what I want to cover here. There's other parts in the brain aspect of the chapter that you should know, but I wanted to highlight the amygdala in particular. So let me know if you have questions on this material, right? The quiz went pretty well overall. But let me know if you have questions about the amygdala or about those studies and the data and what it means there. Otherwise, keep being healthy, keep being safe, and we will talk again soon.